Tonight on the Worldview Weekend Hour, internationally known pastor John MacArthur on his church platform declares that he's not going to fight some of the most well-known cultural Marxist and social justice warriors that are his friend. He does not want to be an island unto himself. What does the Bible say about this? Is this how we as Christians should respond to those trying to transform the church and implement socialism and cultural Marxism into our churches? Should we declare that we don't want to lose friends and surrender? Dr. Andy Woods is my guest tonight. He's a pastor and the president of a seminary. The Worldview Weekend Hour begins right now.
WVW-TV presents the Worldview Weekend Hour with Brannon and Howse. Whether the topic is law, science, government, economics, history, family, social issues, education, or theology, Brannon brings the issues of today into clear focus through the lens of a biblical worldview. And now, here is your host, Brannon Howse.
Welcome, my friends, to the program. Glad you are with us. Dr. Andy Woods joins us from Houston, Texas. As you know, he's a broadcaster with us here at WVW Broadcast Network, sits at this very news desk and delivers his program, and you can watch it at WVWTV.com. Well, a very historical event occurred last week. Many people perhaps don't even realize how historical was the event. As I said in the lead-up, internationally known pastor Dr. John MacArthur declared to some of the biggest cultural Marxists on the planet that he was not going to oppose them on social justice. He said, "I don't want to fight my friends." We'll play the clip for you. Well, I'm not shocked by it because that's exactly what I predicted in my book, Marxianity, that came out in the fall of 2018. MacArthur's surrender and waving of the white flag to these social justice warriors that are transforming the church, well, this occurred in March of 2019. So again, I'm not shocked because I warned about John MacArthur in this book that came out November 2018. For many years, I had red flags with John MacArthur, and I would not promote him. I even aired personally and vocally my concerns about John MacArthur in many areas. However, in about 2010, I saw him taking on the emergent church, the seeker-sensitive church model, Rick Warren's model, the liberalism within evangelicalism to transform our churches. And he was taking it on boldly. Joel Osteen he would take on and others. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to give him some grace and look past these concerns of mine. And I actually thus interviewed him for my radio show twice and had him speak for one of our Worldview Weekends in the Ozarks via Skype. But it was in late 2015, early 2016, I again began to have red flags about John MacArthur. And as I did more research into the men around him, Al Mohler, Lincoln Duncan, and Mark Dever, who he puts on his church platform at his Shepherds Conference year in and year out, I realized, Houston, we have a problem. And joining me to talk about that is a man from Houston, Dr. Andy Woods. Dr. Woods, welcome to the broadcast. Thank you for joining us.
Brannon, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for making time for us. Let's go right away to the first clip by John MacArthur in March of 2019 on the platform of his church as he surrenders to the social justice warriors Al Mohler, Mark Dever, and Lincoln Duncan. We'll tell you about them as I write extensively about all three men in my book, Marxianity. What you need to understand first is that what has occurred on the platform is the challenging of these men when it comes to the social justice statement that John MacArthur wrote along with others, or at least signed his name to, known as the Dallas Statement, and released in 2018. In fact, in an article on his website, John MacArthur declared that social justice was perhaps the greatest, if not one of the greatest threats facing the American church today. Well, ironically, the very next week, he came to our state of Tennessee, over in Nashville, about 3 hours northeast of me, and spoke at a conference with none other than cultural Marxist and co-founder of the Gospel Coalition, Tim Keller, who I write about extensively in this book, Marxianity. Tim Keller, who is totally into social justice and wrote a book called Generous Justice, where he calls for the redistribution of wealth, the reweaving of a community. The same Tim Keller that has declared that we should start churches for the poor and start churches for the unbeliever. We have that on video. This is the same Tim Keller that declared that the purpose of salvation is the restoration of the culture. We have the screenshots of that and have put it in many of our television programs throughout the last few years. This is who he, John MacArthur, spoke with at a conference the very week after signing a social justice statement and declaring that social justice is a great threat to the church. Is that not speaking out of both sides of your mouth? Indeed, I think it is. But if he's so concerned about social justice, why is he bringing social justice warriors Mark Dever, Lincoln Duncan, and Al Mohler to his church platform? We'll tell you about those three men tonight in a big overview because we've covered it many times, but we'll give you the big overview, the big flyover picture. But before the statement by John MacArthur, there was a little tension on the church platform where they were being challenged by John MacArthur's ghostwriter, right-hand man, about social justice. And it got a little tense. And in fact, the statement was made at one point that perhaps if Al Mohler was going to be forced to say what MacArthur's assistant wanted to hear, that maybe that would be a test as to the furtherance of the relationship. Well, then in rushed John MacArthur to declare that he wasn't going to fight his friends on social justice. Now, whether he knows it or not, what they just carried out was what we've been warning about for years: the third way, the Hegelian dialectic process, thesis and antithesis, idea, opposite idea, and they fight, and then they merge together because people will compromise. They don't want conflict. They don't want to lose friendships. They don't want to be an island, as John MacArthur has said, and so they willingly accept their friends and their positions and mold it into their worldview, and that synthesis takes place, and a whole new thesis is born. Thesis and antithesis, fight. The conflict, people compromise. They don't want the conflict, and they merge together and say, we'll all get along anyway. That's the Hegelian dialectic process. In fact, the very first chapter of my book, Marxianity, is all about that, the deception of the dialectical process. And that's what took place on his church platform, whether he realizes it or not. And this conflict led John MacArthur to declare this. Watch this clip.
I don't think there's any difference theologically with where we all stand. And we've navigated that together on every possible platform in every situation. How we respond to the culture around us and the pressures that come on us from the culture, how we navigate those relationships that face us. I get a lot of, and even with this Shepherd's Conference coming up, I got a lot of heat from people on the internet who I don't, somebody has to show it to me because I don't go there. But that you were going to be here because you may have expressed yourself differently on the issue of social justice or whatever other issue it might have been. That seems to be the buzz button anyway. And I said, look, these are my friends. These are men I love. These are men who serve Christ. They've given their life to Him. God has given each of you guys a formidable place in the kingdom, and you've all had an impact on my life. I'll fight error, but I don't fight my friends. Why would I do that? I don't want to become an island.
So that's John MacArthur, March 2019, declaring to three of the biggest social justice warriors in Big Eva. They kept referring to it, by the way, as Big Eva. That means big evangelicalism. And basically saying they represent Big Eva. Well, they certainly don't represent the evangelicalism I'm part of, because first of all, I'm not a Calvinist, never have been, never will be. Now, I have friends that are Calvinists, but many of them are free grace Calvinists versus what I think are the extreme or hyper Calvinists that these men are. But we will define some terms tonight. Is John MacArthur an extreme Calvinist? Is he a hyper Calvinist? Let's talk about that, because that helps us to understand the form of evangelicalism they claim to represent. But first, let's notice what John says. Quote, I don't think there's any difference theologically with where we all stand, end quote. Well, Andy, I wrote an article entitled Marxianity Warns You. John MacArthur finally admits compromise on social justice for the sake of the good old boy club. And in that article I write, how can John MacArthur claim that there's really no difference where they all stand theologically if these men are indeed social justice warriors, and clearly they are, as I prove in the book Marxianity, because social justice changes the mission and purpose and function of the church, the calling of the Christian and the role of the pastor. Therefore, that's a theological transformation from traditional orthodoxy. So how can John MacArthur claim he really doesn't see any difference in the theology of himself and those three men when he's acknowledged they're for social justice? Isn't that right there in its face a contradiction by MacArthur, or at least a lack of understanding of the seriousness of the matter at hand?
Yes, because Marxism is a complete worldview. It's got a different plan of redemption. It's got a different understanding of sin. It's got a different understanding of eschatology. And so for someone to say, well, we all agree on everything, even though y'all are for social justice and I'm not for social justice, I mean, obviously based on that, in and of itself, they don't agree on everything. I mean, it's a clash of worldviews. I mean, I think what he was saying is, I agree with you all on some very narrow soteriological subjects. And as long as we're happy together on those narrow subjects, whatever worldview differences we have, we can kind of just sweep it under the rug. And so he's sort of marginalizing the real differences that he really had with those men, if in fact John MacArthur is against social justice the way he claims.
But that is a theological issue. Is not the social justice coming into the church, changing the mission and function of the church and the purpose of the church, changing away from biblical theology? Is that not a theological issue? And how, therefore, could he agree with him theologically as he claims?
Yeah, it's a different issue theologically. More specifically, it's a major ecclesiological issue, ecclesiology being the doctrine of the church. You articulated why a few moments ago. It's a different eschatology where you're kind of in there to kind of bring in the kingdom, when if you're a premillennialist, someone who believes that Jesus Christ comes back first, then the kingdom comes. You can't agree with that eschatology. It's a different plan of redemption. It's about mopping up society without internally transforming people first via the gospel. So when someone sits on a stage with a bunch of people advocating social justice and claims they're on the same page theologically, although they may have a difference of opinion on social justice, it just demonstrates a lack of comprehensive understanding concerning worldview and theology.
John MacArthur says, quote, God has given each of you guys a formidable place in the kingdom, end quote. You wrote your doctrinal thesis. You are an actual PhD, not honorary. And did you not write your doctrinal thesis on this issue of what is the kingdom of God and when it comes into being? Is that true?
Well, I wrote on a related subject, the doctrine of preterism, which is very much kingdom now. But I did write a book subsequent to that, called The Coming Kingdom, which is a defense of the fact that the kingdom, is completely future. And the reality of the situation is man doesn't bring in the kingdom. The kingdom is something that God alone brings in. Daniel chapter 2, that's that stone cut without human hands, destroying the kingdoms of man in an instant and replacing it with God's eternal kingdom. And so when someone says God has given each of you a place in the kingdom, it's very fuzzy, murky language that I really need a lot more clarification on, because it sounds like he believes, like most likely they believe, that their social justice activities are in fact some kind of manifestation of the kingdom. I mean, we're not in the kingdom now by virtue of the fact that we have all these martyrdoms all over the place. And as we submit to the Lord in our daily walk, he will grant us standing in the kingdom yet to come, different levels of reward, different degrees of authority then, but certainly not now. So I don't know, that statement that he made there was troubling in light of many other statements that he made. But I don't know, I just needed more clarification on that. I didn't know exactly what he was talking about.
And how would he know God has appointed them to strategic places in the kingdom?
Well, he's assuming a lot, isn't he? He's kind of acting like the vicar of Christ, the representative of Christ upon the earth, and as if he has some kind of special pipeline to God, God telling him, oh, this guy has a place in the kingdom, this guy has a place in the kingdom, but not him over there. He's almost ascribing to himself papal authority when he makes a statement like that.
And what's really interesting is that, and what's really sad, because again, for about 5 years I promoted him. I interviewed him twice on radio. Once we had him speak by Skype at our Ozarks conference. I would give his seminary and college free booths. I would not charge them when we charged other groups for booths. We gave them free to his college and seminary on several occasions, even let some of his representatives take the platform and promote his college and seminary to young people at one of our youth conferences. So we looked past some of our concerns. I'm not a Calvinist, I never have been, but we looked past some of our other concerns because, again, we thought he was fighting the transformation of the church today by exposing Rick Warren and the seeker-sensitive church model and the emergent church. And yet, as I point out in my book, Marxianity, the Gospel Coalition, of which he's got 3 of the council members of the Cultural Marxist Gospel Coalition right there on his church platform, Mark Dever, Al Mohler, and Lincoln Duncan. The Gospel Coalition, folks, is nothing but the emergent church repackaged. That's not my opinion. That's a matter of fact. It's documented with footnotes in this book in a whole chapter. The emergent church repackaged. And what's it been repackaged as? As the Gospel Coalition. So the whole reason I started following MacArthur was because of the people and things and movements he was opposing. Now that, as of last week, he's waved the white flag on those issues, there's no reason for me to follow him anymore. And that's why I warned about him, because I saw this coming. I knew this was coming. He'd already done enough to let me know he had surrendered. He just hadn't said it verbally yet for the public to hear. But I knew it because I wrote about it in this book in November of 2019, or excuse me, November 2018, which is why I took my John MacArthur Study Bible and his commentaries and put them in a dark closet. I also have issues with his definition of the gospel and what it is. We'll get to that. Through his Savior Lord issue of perseverance of the saints and his extreme Calvinism, and not to mention his own admitted leaky dispensationalism, as he describes it, which causes him not to use the consistent hermeneutical rules for translating the Bible. So I had many issues that I further came aware of, and then add all the social justice guys he's hanging out with and not opposing and giving a platform to and speaking with at Together for the Gospel in October of 2018, or April 2018, not to mention all the previous years. But even in April of 2018, it had become very clear what Matt Chandler and John Piper and David Platt and Lincoln Duncan and some of these guys all stood for. And yet he keeps sharing the platform with them. And that's when I knew that we had to publicly declare in the book that I no longer endorse him, and I'm embarrassed that I ever promoted him, because I see where he's going. So the point again is, I gave him a pass for some areas where I disagreed with him, because I thought he was going to help us fight the transformation of churches. But now he's surrendered to these guys who are helping lead the way, who are council members of the Gospel Coalition, and the Gospel Coalition is the emergent church repackaged. Now, what's so interesting is he's got them on his church platform for his Shepherds Conference. And I think these guys are wolves, Dever, Duncan, and Mohler. I think that's what they are. If you read my book, Marxianity, you'll see why I would say that. And we can get into some of the reasons tonight. But a few years ago, John MacArthur held a conference known as the Strange Fire Conference. And he was exposing the Word of Faith and the New Apostolic Reformation. Again, I applaud him for exposing the Word of Faith and New Apostolic Reformation. We were exposing the New Apostolic Reformation before many of his people even knew what it was, because I had conversations with some of them who told me they didn't know what the New Apostolic Reformation even was. And then he became aware that it had a new name, it was reorganized, and he started publicly opposing it. And I was very thankful for that. But at that Strange Fire Conference, he went on to lump clear-minded charismatics in with them, I thought, and so did many others, and paint with too broad of a brush. And I know many clear-minded charismatics that love the Lord and preach a clear, uncompromised gospel, and also are joining us in fighting dominion theology, social justice, also known as liberation theology, and the mysticism of the day, and replacement theology, which is the belief that the church has replaced Israel, which is a breeding ground for anti-Semitism. And so many of my clear-minded charismatic friends have joined us in lifting up a shout and warning about these things. And I'm not about to throw them under the bus over some of their issues with which I don't agree with them, because we do agree on the gospel in defense of the church. But MacArthur seemed to paint with a broad brush at his Strange Fire Conference and warn about even the clear-minded charismatics. And I'm not the only one that felt that way. Look it up online. But here's what he said at that conference. Listen to this, because it is germane to the topic at hand. At the Strange Fire Conference, MacArthur said, quote, "When theologically respected conservative continuists, who represent a very small minority in the charismatic movement, when they give any credibility to the movement, the whole movement gets respect because of who they are. And then you have this young generation of restless, reformed young people coming along and attaching to their heroes who are open to this charismatic movement and affirming the continuation of the signed gifts. And so they follow their heroes and either embrace that idea of continuation or are open to that idea, which is essentially one and the same. When notable continuous scholars give credence to charismatic interpretations or fail to directly condemn unbiblical charismatic practices, they provide theological cover for a movement that is deadly dangerous, end quote. Well, here's what I would say to John MacArthur using his own words, but in the context of the social justice. When a notable evangelical pastor like yourself gives credence to social justice and social justice warriors like Al Mohler, Lyndon Duncan, Mark Dever, the Gospel Coalition, or Together for the Gospel, and you fail to directly condemn specifically their unbiblical social justice agenda that includes redefining the mission and purpose of Christians and the church, you provide theological cover for a movement that is deadly dangerous, end quote. A movement, by the way, he even admitted in his Dallas statement was perhaps one of the greatest threats to the church. So if it is, why on earth would you bring these men to your platform when it's been known for a long time who they are, and what they represent? Dr. Wood, your response?
Well, the part of the statement that was so indicting, so self-indicting, and to be frank with you, the first time I saw it, I thought it was fake news, that someone had, dubbed a voiceover on there or something. I couldn't believe someone would say this, but it's obviously authentic as I watched it 2, 3, 4 times. He basically makes a statement there that I don't fight my friends. Now, you go to the book of Galatians, chapter 2, verse 11, where the apostle Paul confronted Peter to his face over the gospel itself. And he didn't say, well, Peter, you and I are going to be just fine because we're friends. No, I assume Peter and Paul were very good friends, and yet Paul confronted Peter to his face. And you go over to the book of Jude, verses 3 and 4, where it says to earnestly contend for the faith. It doesn't say earnestly contend for the faith as long as those you're fighting happen to be your friends or your buddies. So A, why would he platform these people to begin with? And B, why would he make a statement that I don't fight my friends? In other words, if you're a friend of mine, you get a pass, if you're disseminating some sort of error. I think in so doing, John MacArthur, kind of has the mantle of being a conservative defender. And I think he just forfeited that mantle. It doesn't belong to him anymore. It needs to be transferred to somebody else or another group of people or whoever. But there's no way that the evangelical public can look at him as the foremost defender of conservative Christianity when he's basically saying, come on the platform and teach social justice nonsense. And you have the free pass to do that because you guys are my buddies.
Yeah, that's a real problem. Even if he didn't let them do that there, he knows they're doing it everywhere else. And in fact, here's what I wrote in my article on our website. Folks can read it, worldviewtimes.com. Marxianity warns you, subtitled, John MacArthur finally admits compromise on social justice for the sake of the good old boy club. And here's what I wrote, quote, many godly families and individuals have taken a hard and sacrificial stand against the social justice, communitarian church growth movement of Peter Drucker, Bob Buford, Rick Warren, Tim Keller, Bill Hybels. Many of these families have fought to hold the line doctrinally as to what is the gospel versus the social gospel. They have earnestly contended for the faith in hopes of not giving sway to their home church, succumbing to the transformation of the purpose and function of the church as promoted by groups like the Gospel Coalition led by Mohler, Dever, and Duncan. These individuals and families have been marginalized, characterized, bullied, intimidated, shunned, and eventually forced to leave churches that were founded by their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers. I know this firsthand from numerous callers into my live radio program, as well as from their heartbreaking emails to our office. These families have sacrificed for truth. They have counted the cost. They have not been found wanting in the hour of loneliness and isolation. They have had to walk away from churches in which they were dedicated as infants, in which they were baptized when coming to salvation. They have walked away from compromised churches in which they were married and in the church lawn of which previous generations are buried. They have held the ground for biblical truth and it cost them. And it cost them such things as friendships, relationships, and it has placed them on an island of loneliness and isolation. And they would do it all over again because they realized the eternal cost of compromise for a group consensus or the sin of going along to get along. Those are the ones that will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servants," end quote. Dr. Woods, I believe there has occurred an historical event with what John MacArthur has done. I mean, after all, the man has a college or a university. I know it's on probation, but he has a university. He has a seminary. He has a Bible with his name on it. Suppose he sold over 1 million copies of the John MacArthur Study Bible. He's on hundreds of radio stations. He has sold millions of books. And as you said, many look to him. And many have looked to him to hold the line. And they've been encouraged by his ministry to do just that, even if they didn't agree with his Calvinism, as did I not agree with his Calvinism and do not. We still appreciated his holding the line doctrinally, which is one of the reasons I looked past some of my concerns with him, as I said, and interviewed him and promoted him, because I thought this guy's going to go all the way and hold the line. But now he's capitulated. He's compromised. And not only is he compromised, he's done it on what he says himself is one of the greatest threats facing the church, social justice. And ironically, he did it at a shepherd's conference in front of thousands of pastors in person, not to mention those streaming online. And the conference was all themed faithfulness and celebrating his 50 years of ministry. I mean, how ironic that on the hallmark of his 50th year of ministry at a conference about being faithful, he compromises and drives it right into the ditch. And I believe it's historic because I believe many people that have been fighting on the front line to contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, to hold the line doctrinally, to stand fast, all these military terms used by the Apostle Paul in the epistles against the men who've risen from within, Acts 20, or as you referenced, Jude 3. Many of them now are disheartened because we're hearing from them. Well, what about the ones we're not hearing from? I believe, Dr. Woods, many people are going to say, well, if John MacArthur is not going to hold the line, and he's willing to compromise, so he's not an island, so he doesn't lose his friends, why should I lose my friends or family relationships or lifelong church? Why should I be uncomfortable and be an island? If he's not going to stand, why should I? And I believe John MacArthur, as a leader, has just waved the white flag, not only for himself, but he's caused millions, perhaps, over the next few weeks and months to wave the white flag. And I believe in the next few years, we're going to watch social justice sweep over churches where people had been opposing it, holding the line, and now, following the example of John MacArthur, are going to sit down. What say you?
Well, as you're talking there, I'm thinking again of the Galatians 2 passage where Paul confronted Peter to his face when Peter started to sink back into legalism and Phariseeism. And in the context of that, people can go read it and study that out. It's a tremendous passage. He talks about people that were being led astray. Close ministry associates, he names one by name, that was led astray because of what Peter was doing. So this is something that Paul brings out when he confronts Peter. In other words, Peter, this is an action that's not just affecting you. This is an action that's affecting others because of the position you have within what we would call Christendom or Christianity at that time. And as you said before, whether people like it or not, John MacArthur has a place of great visibility. He has a place of great prominence, and because of some of the very good things he's done in the past, and you mentioned many of them, people look to him as sort of a defender of conservative, orthodox, biblical Christianity and a conservative worldview. And because he's done this and says, I oppose error unless it's my friends that are promoting it, and platforms these gentlemen that were up here with him on the stage, I mean, this is a decision that he has made, a statement that he has made that doesn't just affect him and his standing before the Lord at the judgment of rewards, at the Bema Seat judgment of Christ, but it affects all of these people that look to him, and all of these young shepherds and pastors, we would call them preacher boys or wannabe preacher boys, kind of look to him as the leader. And what kind of impact is this statement going to have on the whole church now, given the prominence and visibility of John MacArthur? And if I were in his position and I let a mistake like that out of my mouth, and I've made my share of mistakes, Brandon, I'm sure you've made a mistake or two in your past, what I would do, and this is just a little free advice, I would immediately but publicly retract what he just said and try to preserve what's left of loyal opposition to social justice theology in seminaries and in local churches.
You know what's really, and I agree with that, but you know what's really disheartening is that, and this is one of the issues I had with John MacArthur years ago, but again, I looked past him when he started opposing Rick Warren, the seeker-sensitive church model, the emergent church and stuff. But one of the issues I had with him was a book he wrote in 2000 called Why Government Can't Save You, an alternative to political activism. Now, I don't know anyone that believes government can save you. So I don't know why you would need to write a book called Why Government Can't Save You, because I think pretty much every Christian knows our salvation is not found in our government or in Christian activism of any kind. But nonetheless, in 2000, he wrote this book. And I picked it up and started reading it in about 2002, 2003. And I marked it all up. And these are the markings from 2002, 2003. And you can see it's all flagged and tagged. And so I pulled it out of the attic and started going through it again. And what's really shocking, folks, is this is a treatise on Christian activism in which Christian conservative activists are called rebel-rousing malcontents and all kinds of other insults. They're told how ungodly they're being, how unbiblical they're being. He goes on to declare that the founding fathers sinned and violated New Testament principles when they founded America. Refers to America as a democracy, which we're not. We're a constitutional republic. There's all kinds of double talk and contradictions in this book we'll get into in another program. But this book is nothing but a treatise to discourage Christians from being involved, other than voting. He even has a sermon at the back of the book by Spurgeon, which discourages people from doing anything but voting. That's it. And MacArthur himself says Christians are not called to be involved in legislation or lobbying or pushing for a slate of Christian candidates, that any time or money we spend on those things is money away from the gospel. Well, newsflash, the Great Commission isn't just the gospel. The Great Commission is to preach the gospel. They hear the gospel, repent, and place their faith and trust in Christ, and then they become disciples, and then we disciple them. And part of that is to make sure that we keep the pulpits free, the airwaves open, our Christian schools open, our homeschooling available, and parental authority intact among the religious and economic freedom and the economic freedom that funds those kind of things, so we can make disciples and make more of them. It's not either or. It's not either being involved in Christian activism for the sake of the gospel and building Christian disciples or Christian activism. They can both be true. Now, I understand the dangers of moralizing and thinking that all of your hope and energy can be put into somehow Christianizing America and creating a dominion or a kingdom on earth. That's that moralizing, that somehow we can get people to act morally, even though they're lost and on their way to hell. Somehow that'll make a better, just society. Well, if we have a great society full of unsaved people that are acting moral, they're still on their way to hell. But here's what's so ironic. He writes a book going after the Christian conservative activist while he gives a pass and grace to the progressive Christian activist sitting right there on his church platform. I mean, as I document in my book, Marxianity, Al Mohler, Lincoln Duncan, and Mark Dever are involved in some of the most progressive things around. Al Mohler, for instance, has called a hero communist Nelson Mandela. A hero. Communist and terrorist Nelson Mandela. Al Mohler is working with the Kern Family Foundation, a liberal foundation that he's admitted on video is funding his Commonweal project. By the way, Commonweal, it's spelled W-E-A-L. You know what seems to be missing? The T-H. And you get Commonwealth. We also have documented in this book and in my TV shows the video clips and screenshots where Al Mohler is sending kids off to the Acton Institute from his Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. You know what the Acton Institute is? Well, according to news reports from the 70s, there's a guy named Bob Sirica who was a Pentecostal who became a homosexual, performed homosexual marriages back in the 70s, according to the news reports. And we have the screenshots from those papers on the West Coast from the 70s. He converted to Roman Catholicism. Apparently, he's a homosexual priest. And he runs the Acton Institute, which passes itself off as libertarian, but in reality, if you study them, they're promoting communitarianism, mixing of socialism with capitalism, social justice. Common good, human flourishing. These are all buzzwords now that hide social justice. Common good, human flourishing. And by the way, guess who they love? Tim Keller. Guess who they had speak recently at their big annual banquet? The reported homosexual priest who runs Acton Institute had Tim Keller. Tim Keller, who says we need to start churches for the poor, that we owe the poor as much money as we can give them, that the purpose of salvation is the restoration of creation. No, that's dominion theology. That doesn't happen until Romans 8. That doesn't happen until the second coming. Yet Al Mohler is sending kids from his Southern Baptist Theological Seminary off to Acton Institute. He's also working with the Oikonomia Network, which is a group of colleges, Christian colleges and seminaries that are planting transformational churches, and the thought leaders include people connected to, and the right-hand people of, Tim Keller. People that praise Tim Keller, promote Tim Keller, have Tim Keller's worldview for transformational social justice churches. And Al Mohler is involved with the Oikonomia Network to develop curriculum and students who graduate and go and plant those kind of churches. It's all documented on video and in my book. And so you have Al Mohler, and we could go on and on about him, who has said and apologized in 2014 for not believing in sexual orientation, apologized on video for that. Then you got Mark Dever, who's sitting there. Mark Dever, who has promoted many liberal things, including the survey Living Out, created by an Anglican priest, Sam Alberry, who calls himself gay at one time and is declared to be same-sex attracted Anglican priest. He built a survey called Living Out, and it's 10 points to decide whether or not your church is being inclusive to the LGBTQ community. And last year, as we documented in the book Marxianity and on video in the TV shows showing the screenshots, Mark Dever's church sponsored a conference on teaching people how to use the Living Out survey to see if your church is LGBTQ inclusive for church involvement of LGBT people. Look, we're not picking on the LGBTQ people, but there are standards for church membership and leadership, whether heterosexual or i.e. homosexual. And one of the 10 points in that plan, by the way, included whether or not your church shares your children with same-sex attracted people the same way you share meals and holidays. Really? And there's a lot more we could say about Mark Dever. And then you've got Ligon Duncan sitting there. Ligon Duncan is planting seminaries with Tim Keller and praising Sam Alberry, the same-sex attracted Anglican priest. Now, these guys are all on the platform of the Gospel Coalition. The Gospel Coalition, which is openly calling for reparations, praising Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of mandatory minimum incomes. They had an article on the page of Tibeti, one of their council members, urging Christian leaders, or Christians, to urge their leaders to tell their congregations to vote for Hillary Clinton. What you got is a bunch of social justice, emergent church, liberal, progressive, political activists. And John MacArthur puts those three men who are part of that organization doing these things on his church platform and says, I give you a pass, you're my friends. But what's he do? Writes a book in 2000 condemning conservative Christian activists, declaring that America was founded in sin and rebellion, and goes on to tell us we have to submit to the government even regardless of how cruel and ungodly it might be, with a twisted view of Romans 13 and an absolute ignorance about the form of government we have, a constitutional republic. So here's my question, John. Why do you write a book trashing conservative Christians who are involved in Christian activism to maintain the liberty and freedom of the pulpit, which you benefit from, publishing houses, freedom of press, freedom of religion, Christian schools, seminaries, and colleges, which you make a living from, open the airways and keep them open, which you have your shows on, parental authority, a free market system that funds all that, which you benefit from as well, as do all of us? Why do you go after conservative Christian activists, but you give a pass to these progressive Christian activists? Dr. Woods?
Well, I think that's a very valid point, and it's a double-edged sword. And the fact of the matter is the progressive left, to my mind, is far more active politically than the conservative biblical right. We can't even get our folks half the time to get out and vote. I'm a pastor of a local church, and I emphasize constantly the need for people to be involved in politics, bare minimum voting, and perhaps other things as God leads. But, you can't have it two ways. You can't tell the conservatives that they're being unbiblical by standing up for the unborn, and at the same time not giving the same criticism to the Christian, so-called Christian progressive left that wants to bring in, universal health care as a constitutional right, thinking they're serving Christ as they're doing it. They think a borderless society is immoral, a border society is immoral. They want a borderless society. It's interesting, I've heard Nancy Pelosi talk about this recently. She keeps using biblical verses and she keeps referring to morals, and she's basing her position, I guess, on religious dogma. So here's the deal. You want to criticize the conservatives for participating in the political process based on their understanding of the Bible, then you've got to offer that equal criticism to the liberals, to the progressives that are just as adept at not only political activity, but using the Bible wrongly, I think, to support their position. So we need some consistency.
Absolutely. Listen to what MacArthur says on page 7 of his book, Why Government Can't Save You. Quote, also many present-day Christian activists seem to be unaware of how much their methodology parallels that of liberal Christians at the turn of the 20th century. Like those misguided idealists, contemporary evangelicals became enamored of temporal issues at the expense of eternal values. Evangelical activists, in essence, are simply preaching a politically conservative version of the old social gospel, emphasizing social and cultural concerns above spiritual ones. In that framework, the government becomes more and more the earthly ally. This is very interesting because reality is he's saying this about conservatives and saying, you're just doing what the liberals did, but you're doing a conservative version of it. Well, reality is the guys he's talking to on the platform are doing this very thing. And yet he doesn't call them out. How ironic. Let's go to our next clip from John MacArthur's Shepherd's Conference with these cultural Marxists that he's praising and saying he's not going to separate from, that God's appointed a special place in the kingdom of, just last week. Watch this next clip.
I have been trying to lay out for 30 plus years an understanding of how evangelicals should engage the culture. And I cut my teeth apologetically confronting cultural Marxism and the entire network of issues of the left. You look at who I invite to my campus, you look at who I cite, you look at who I platform, I feel pretty good about the message that I'm sending there.
So clearly Al Mohler is aware of cultural Marxism, at least he says he is. He claims he's been fighting it for years. He says, look at who I put on my platform and look at who I cite. Well, we have. We look at who you put on your platform and you partner with, and it's a lot of cultural Marxists. So again, I think Al Mohler is talking out of both sides of his mouth. Here's a little secret for most of you guys. These guys get on radio, traditional terrestrial radio, and they sound really conservative. You know why? Because that's where the older donors are. And then when they get on social media and their little coffee clutches of intellectuals and academics, that's when they start showing their true colors. So you got to be very careful. Very typical in the deep state of evangelicalism for them to play both sides to the middle. But if you want to look at who Mohler has been platforming and quoting, yeah, he's platforming and working with folks involved in the Oikonomia network, planting transformational churches on the model of Tim Keller and Rick Warren. Look at some of the people he puts on his platform, like Russell Moore, who came from his seminary. Al Mohler, who gave the inaugural address to Russell Moore's installation as the president of the Southern Baptist Ethics Religious Liberty Commission. You won't find a more progressive liberal guy in the evangelical deep state than Russell Moore, calling Jesus an immigrant, working directly with Barack Obama for amnesty, pushing ecumenicalism, pushing social justice, sitting on the Evangelical Immigration Roundtable, funded by George Soros, sitting there with cultural Marxist, neo-Marxist Jim Wallace, who's praised the communists in South America for the last 30, 40 years. That's who he platforms. People like Russell Moore, who he called the man from Issachar. So yeah, Al, we have been watching. And yeah, we're very aware, I believe, that you talk out of both sides of your mouth, and you count on the fact that most people don't do the homework we do, that we then document in our radio show, TV show, and I document in my book, Marxianity. And you're praising of men like Nelson Mandela, a communist and a terrorist, whose wife used to put tires around people and light them on fire. Which, by the way, in this 6th hour, hour 6 of Sabotage, I talk about Marxianity, and sadly, I show video footage of a man and then a woman being lit on fire for opposing the communist government under Nelson Mandela. I also show a speech by President Ronald Reagan from the White House talking about what was going on there. And then you ask yourself why Al Mohler declares Nelson Mandela a hero. Yeah, Al, we've been watching who you quote and platform. And that's why we call you a cultural Marxist, and you're very aware of it, but you don't fool us. Not to mention, you're one of your own graduates. Nate Collins wrote a book, All But Invisible, and the back of the book, he describes himself as a homosexual man in a mixed orientation marriage and is pushing the whole LGBTQ same-sex attracted thing in the church, which led to this conference called Revoice. And that supposedly took place with this guy getting his degree from your school, writing the book while he was at your school, and only recently left the school. Dr. Woods?
Well, I think you determine the worldview of somebody not just based on what they say on a radio station, but who they hang around with and who they promote. You know, the Bible is very clear that bad company corrupts good morals. And if you're running around with a certain crowd and you're connected to them and you're appearing at each other's conferences all of the time and you're linking together in terms of internet websites and all that kind of stuff, that is a clue as to what someone's worldview actually is. You can't evaluate someone on a blog article that they write. It's what kind of crowd are they running with. And John MacArthur, for whatever reason, is running with this crowd, which to my mind ameliorates all of the conservative stances that he's taken on so many of these issues over the years. I mean, why would you take a conservative stance on something and then turn around and platform someone that opposes that stance in everything they do? It just makes no sense to me. Well, and so something is really wrong.
And then you had the fact that Al Mohler is working, as I said, with the Acton Institute, led by what is reported to be a gay Catholic priest, Robert Sirico, whose Acton Institute did a whole video and seminar praising the Jesuits. So wait a minute. They're praising the Jesuits. We know the Jesuits were for what? Worship of Mary, social justice. The term social justice was actually coined by a Jesuit priest in 1840, Luigi Tapernelli, 8 years before the Communist Manifesto came out in 1848 by Karl Marx. So social justice, it came from the Jesuits, and there's the Acton Institute, as we've done on TV and played the video clip, praising the Jesuits. And yet Mohler works with the Acton Institute, sends the kids from his school there. And you know who one of the teachers at the Acton Institute University is, that they can get extra credit for attending? Peter Kraft. Peter Kraft, who wrote the book Ecumenical Jihad, where he says he was out surfing and hit his head and apparently went unconscious or had an out-of-body experience and goes off to heaven, and there sits Jesus, Mohammed, and Confucius, and Buddha, and guess what? They all made it to heaven. Now, why on earth would Al Mohler work with the Acton Institute that's promoting social justice, promoting globalism, promoting leftist progressive organizations, praising the Jesuits, and booking speakers to speak like Peter Kraft, who wrote Ecumenical Jihad? Yeah, you know what, Al? We've been watching who you've been quoting and platforming and working with. And we're not so stupid as to fall for the line that apparently a lot of those shepherds sitting there just fell for, because guess what? A lot of them don't have the time to do the research we do. They're busy studying, marrying, bearing, and counseling. So I hope a lot of those shepherds that were sitting there, that were having the wool pulled over their eyes, would get my book Marxianity and realize, I don't think you understand who it is talking to you. And that's why I said MacArthur should change the name of his conference from the Shepherd's Conference to the Wolves Conference if he's going to keep putting men like Al Mohler, Lyndon Duncan, and Mark Dever on his church platform. Let's go to the next clip.
Knowing exactly how to help younger evangelicals figure these things out, which is actually my job as a seminary president, that's not real easy. And I will confess that. But I'm trying to be as clear as I can be on this.
Well, actually, Al, it is pretty easy. It's actually very easy to figure all this out if you know what you believe. If you understand the worldviews of the day, the philosophies of the day, and then you apply them through a biblical worldview, it's quite easy to figure all this out and know how to respond and what to teach young people. All you got to do is know what the terms mean. What does white privilege mean? What does social justice mean? What does human flourishing, common good mean? What's globalism? Why are these things bad? What's the Bible say about all these things? It's not that hard. Al Mohler, Andy, is acting like this is so hard to figure out. Let me tell you something. I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I got dyslexia. I had to really work to get through school. But apparently maybe I just, instead of having a lot of book sense, I just have more common sense than Al. Maybe he's educated beyond his intelligence, but it's not that hard to figure out. What say you?
Well, I would say God has given us a plumb line of truth, a completed canon of Scripture. We've had it for 2,000 years. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 17, specifically makes the claim that that completed canon of Scripture will equip you for every good work. I mean, it's been very effective in the church for the last 2,000 years in terms of warding off heresies, going all the way back to Arianism early on in Christendom, etc., etc. So why all of a sudden now is it so complex? I mean, is the word different? Did we somehow get a version of it that's been amended or watered down or dumbed down? No, it's just a matter of going to the Word of God and building your case from the text of Scripture. And in these clips you're playing, that's not what I'm hearing from these guys. I'm not hearing references to Scripture. I'm not hearing exegesis of passages. I'm hearing all this talk about relationships and kids and this and that and how we need to do a better job. Whatever happened to thus saith the Lord? I mean, let's go to the book and see what God has said as Christians have done for the last 2,000 years and take our stand based on that. It's not complex at all.
No, not at all. Let's go to our next clip.
And in fact, my concern on racial issues is that I do not drive our grandchildren into the arms of the LGBTQIA issue, where already our younger people don't want to touch that issue because they know that it immediately marginalizes them. So one thing I want to make sure I do is I want to look hard at my own tradition and my own tradition's failures with regard to the communion of the saints, the image of God in man, loving our neighbors, and look hard at where we failed, own up to that, so that I don't, the argument that's out there. The church's failure in LGBTQIA area, not to affirm it, is just like its failure in the area of slavery and segregation. I want to break that argument apart. And I want to say slavery and segregation was a failure of biblical fidelity. Caving into LGBTQIA affirmation is also a failure of biblical fidelity. And where I'm standing there because I'm standing on the Bible.
All right, here's another example of a guy talking out of both sides of his mouth. But am I shocked? No, because as I document in the book Marxianity, Lincoln Duncan, who runs Reformed Theological Seminary, he's planning churches with cultural Marxist Tim Keller, who's co-founder of the Gospel Coalition that he's a council member for and with. His organization, his seminary, Reformed Theological Seminary, they put out a document that I talk about in Marxianity. It is promoting the three-legged stool: government, corporations, and the social sector, i.e. nonprofits, the church. Government, corporations, and the religious sector. If we can just do the three-legged stool of communitarianism, we can help reweave and renew the culture in the community. And he's bringing in Tim Keller to speak last year for Reformed Theological Seminary. Tim Keller, who has endorsed the Living Out Sam Alberry survey. So he says that he doesn't want to drive his kids into the arms of the LGBTQ agenda. Then I would ask Lincoln Duncan, why are you working with Tim Keller, who's working with the Living Out pro-LGBTQ inclusive survey and speaking at their conferences overseas and affirming same-sex attracted, by his own admission, Anglican priest Sam Alberry? Why are you working with Tim Keller? And why did you make those comments on the platform of John MacArthur's church? And the very next week, you went to the conference of the Ligonier Ministries, R.C. Sproul's ministry. He's now passed away. But the very next week, what did you do? You sat there and you recommended a book by Sam Alberry, the Anglican priest who has called himself at one time gay and same-sex attracted, and is pushing for the inclusion of the LGBT community into the life and function of the church. And yet you sit there the week before and say, you don't want to drive our kids into the arms of the LGBTQ, and yet the next week you recommend Sam Alberry? Now, folks, you understand when I'm telling you these guys talk out of both sides of their mouth? Now, look, we all have to work at being consistent. But how hard is it to be consistent in these areas, right? Watch this clip of Lincoln Duncan from just, well, the week after he just made that statement.
And I think if you want to get a wise, careful, biblical take on the issue of identity and same-sex attraction, either Kevin DeYoung's book on homosexuality or Sam Alberry's book, Is God Anti-Gay, will give you a better take on how identity ought to relate to issues in connection with same-sex attraction than the kinds of opinions that were shared at the Revoice conference, which I find to be unhelpful.
Well, the Revoice conference was, again, these guys that are claiming to be same-sex attracted. You know, the Apostle Paul says, as were some of you. And yet some of them at that Revoice conference held in the summer of 2018 were describing themselves as gay men who don't practice. One of them, again, who wrote a book called Indivisible, said on the back of the book and the Amazon description that he's a gay man living in a mixed orientation marriage. No, the Apostle Paul says, as were some of you. And here's Lincoln Duncan saying we don't want to push our kids into the arms of the LGBT community. At John MacArthur's conference, he says that. The next week, he runs the Ligoniers conference and says what you just heard about Sam Alberry. Here's Sam Alberry.
Sam Alberry, Oxford 1H3. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the bishops for their hard work. I'm sure it was painful for them, but I think you don't become a bishop for an easy life. I am same-sex attracted and have been my entire life. By that I mean that I have sexual, romantic, and deep emotional attractions to people of the same sex. I choose to describe myself this way because sexuality is not a matter of identity for me, and that has become good news. My primary sense of worth and fulfillment as a human being is not contingent on being romantically or sexually fulfilled, and this is liberating. The most fully human and complete person who ever lived was Jesus Christ. He never married, he was never in a romantic relationship, and never had sex. If we say these things are intrinsic to human fulfillment, we are calling our Saviour subhuman. I've met literally hundreds of Christians in my situation and know of thousands more who are same-sex attracted and who joyfully affirm the traditional understanding of marriage being between a man and a woman and the only godly context for sex. If you don't hear from more of us, it is because it is very hard to stand up and describe ourselves in this way. As someone who uses the language of same-sex attraction, I have to say that my church has not become a safe place for me. And by church, I don't mean my congregation, I mean this synod. Not because of what the report says, but because of what has happened since. I was bullied at school for being gay. I now feel I'm being bullied at synod for being same-sex attracted and faithful to the teaching of Jesus on marriage.
Now, here's the problem. These guys want to run around claiming to be same-sex attracted, and what we see with some of them is that they say things like, well, I don't practice. I'm same-sex attracted. I don't practice. I'm a faithful Christian. But what have we seen some of these people do? As soon as people in the church accept that, and it gets the nose of the camel under the tent, some of them come out and say, oh, you know what? After all, we are going to practice. Again, the Apostle Paul says, as were some of you. Now, here's part of the problem. If you go to the website of Living Out, run by Sam Alberry, I found an article last night where one of the authors on there is talking about being physical without being intimate. And they talk about the fact that, you know, you can hug and kiss your kids. This is just creepy stuff. And this is what Sam Alberry, I found on his website. And this is who Lincoln Duncan is recommending. But the week before, he's worried about pushing his grandkids or next generation into the arms of the LGBTQ. Are these guys not speaking on both sides of their mouth? What do you make of all this, Dr. Woods?
Well, what I make of it is what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11. You made reference to it a few moments ago, but Paul is very clear, do not be deceived, neither fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, the effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God, such as some of you were. You were washed, etc. It's very clear that Paul puts the sin of homosexuality on equal par with all those other things on the list: idolaters, adulterers, revilers, drunkards, thieves. And so, if we're going to get into this business of redefining a sinful pattern as some kind of alternative lifestyle, then Katie barred the door. We've got to do it with everything else mentioned on this particular list. And I would just ask people to apply what we just heard on that tape, that recording rather, with any other sin mentioned here: adulterer, covetous, drunkard, thief, swindler. I mean, would this individual make sense if he was talking about any other issue other than homosexuality? And if it doesn't pass that test, then what he is saying is unbalanced and it's unbiblical. And people that platform individuals like this are partnering with those that are openly promoting evil. And that's basically my take on it. I look at it through the lens of 1 Corinthians 6, chapters 9 through 11, verses 9 through 11. I don't have to go read a book that he recommended I read. I don't have to read 10,000 journal articles. I just have to be a basic Bible reader. And I can see that God has a plan for sexuality from Genesis to Revelation. And trying to fit homosexuality into that plan is, to me, like trying to explain away the Atlantic Ocean. It's an impossibility for the Bible reader.
And sitting on that platform again with Lincoln Duncan and Mark Dever was Al Mohler, who in 2014 on video apologized for not believing in sexual orientation. So all three of these men are pushing that LGBTQ agenda, whether they know or not. Mark Dever sponsored a conference with the Living Out Survey. Al Mohler is apologizing for not believing in sexual orientation. Lincoln Duncan's recommending Sam Alberry. And yet there's MacArthur putting him on his platform, which is why in the book Marxianity, I said, when it came out in November 2018, John MacArthur is someone I apologize for ever having promoted. I'm embarrassed I ever promoted him. I should have gone with my gut feeling and reaction about him originally. But I also described him as a bridger. Whether he knows it or not, he's bridging the left and the right together. And now he's proven publicly what I warned about in the book Marxianity. Let's go to the next clip.
I have lived long enough to remember that when I came of age as an evangelical, this was the same discussion. And it was being driven by the evangelical left, people like Jim Wallace and Sojourners, the Sojourners community.
They're still there.
Yes, but the difference is they have followed the consistent logic of their own position, and they have been pulled. I mean, they're no longer theologically orthodox, nor any semblance thereof.
And they've been left behind by the culture.
Well, yes, exactly right.
They can't get left enough,
Well, yeah, I think you may need to update yourself on where they are. I think they're trying. Actually, in many ways, there.
They're unneedful to the left now.
Except as a political coalition. Yeah. Except as a political coalition to the left.
Well, that just shows you how clueless Lincoln Duncan is. He's either being deceptive or he's clueless. Lincoln Duncan, he says that Jim Wallace has kind of been left behind by the culture, that he's unneeded by the left. Are you kidding me, Lincoln? Even your buddy Al Mohler tells you might want to get up to date on that. I think guys like Lincoln Duncan just like to hear themselves talk, to be honest with you. And he's obviously extremely ignorant as to the fact that Jim Wallace is right in the dead center of what's going on. Does he not remember that Jim Wallace was a spiritual advisor to the President of the United States, Barack Obama? Does he not know that Jim Wallace is being interviewed by some of the most liberal television networks in America still? Does he not know that Jim Wallace joined Tim Keller, who they're all buddies with at the Gospel Coalition? Jim Wallace joined Tim Keller, co-founder of the Gospel Coalition, at Wheaton College last year to organize all these religious leaders. So let me make sure you understand. Lincoln Duncan, Al Mohler, and Mark Dever, council members of the Gospel Coalition, Cultural Marxist Gospel Coalition, that's the Emergent Church repackaged. That is, their organization said, go vote for Hillary Clinton on their website. They're pushing social justice, reparations, white privilege, praising mandatory minimum incomes. Those guys are part of that. Tim Keller founded it. They work with him. And yet Jim Wallace joined Tim Keller at Wheaton College to figure out what to do about Donald Trump. And yet Lincoln Duncan wants to tell you the culture has left him behind, Jim Wallace, and they don't really need him. You want to respond before we run out of time, Andy?
Well, I covered that on your network, that Wheaton Gathering. And that was a meeting designed to divorce evangelicalism from supporting Donald Trump. And Jim Wallace was behind much of that. He was one of the key leaders, along with many other progressives that I wish I had time to go into. But the money trail goes from George Soros to Jim Wallace.
That's right.
To evangelicalism in an attempt to move evangelicalism away from its support of Donald Trump in the hopes that we'll get a Hillary-like president in the future, and that will make George Soros's goal of socializing and communizing the United States all the more easy. So for someone to say, Jim Wallace is not a player anymore, I like the advice he got from one of his friends there. You might want to get yourself up to speed on that one.
Absolutely. Well, in our next program, because we're out of time, we will answer the question, is John MacArthur a hyper-Calvinist, an extreme Calvinist, and what role does all this play in this? And we'll look at his book, Why Government Can't Save You, the very troubling things he's saying that I think are softening up the church for interfaith dialogue by partnering with men like James White, who had an interfaith dialogue with a Jew-hating, Hitler-defending, jihadi-preaching imam, Yasser Qadhi, in our town. So John MacArthur, I think, is softening up the church for interfaith dialogue by working with James White, even after he did that, and he's softening up the church not to resist the cultural Marxist, red-green axis revolution going on in America through his book, Why Government Can't Save You. We'll look at all that and more in our next installment of the Worldview Weekend Hour with Dr. Andy Woods, whose website is andywoodsministries.org. If you appreciate this program, please support what we're doing. It's vital we hear from you. Where else do you get information like this, unless through the WVW Broadcast Network that includes programmers like Dr. Woods? You can make a donation at wvwfoundation.com.